let's dive straight into the deep end, metaphysics, specifically the age-old connection between God and being. The Greeks touched upon both, but didn't really connect the dots systematically. Then came the medievals, who really threw themselves into this puzzle. Can thinking about what it means to be help us grasp God? And conversely, can reflecting on God shed light on the nature of existence itself? This is where the intellectual fireworks start. So, when we talk about proving God's existence, Thomas Aquinas gives us his famous 5 ways. Think of them as different angles of attack. The first two, motion and efficient causes, are pretty grounded in the physical world, Aristotle's stuff. The fifth one, teleology, also looks at the physical world, finding purpose or design. But then you have the third and fourth ways. These seem different. They don't start with specific physical facts like motion or design. Instead, they begin with the very fact of being, of existence itself. That's why we're focusing on these latter two. They're more metaphysical, aiming to understand God through the concept of being itself. Let's zoom in on the fourth way. Thomas argues like this: look around. Things come in degrees, right? Some things are hotter than others, closer to the hottest thing. Some are truer, closer to the most true. He applies this to goodness, nobility, and ultimately to being itself. If there's a most hot, there must be a most being. And just like fire is the source of all heat, this ultimate most being is the cause of all lesser degrees of being in everything else. So this prime cause, this source of all being we call God. It's a neat analogy, connecting the physical world's hierarchy to a metaphysical one. Now, hold on a second. Does this argument actually work as a proof? Well, there are objections. First off, what even are degrees of being? Is being something you can measure like temperature? Sounds a bit fuzzy. Second, how do we use the word being? Is it the same kind of thing when we say God is and when we say a rock is? Aristotle already pointed out that being isn't said the same way for a substance like Socrates and an accident like his whiteness. Maybe there's a similar difference here. And third, if God is the cause of our being, how does that work? Is it like a substance being the substrate for an accident? Or like fire heating iron? It seems different. But here's the kicker. Even if this proof isn't perfectly rigorous, its value lies in the questions it forces us to ask. It pushes us towards a deeper understanding of God's nature and how he relates to the world, potentially going beyond just seeing him as the first mover. This brings us to a major showdown, highlighted by John Duns Scotus. On one side, Avicenna, the great Islamic philosopher. On the other, Averroes, the commentator on Aristotle. What's their beef? It starts with what metaphysics should study. Avicenna says, metaphysics should be about being itself, its universal properties. Its goal is to prove God as the ultimate cause of all beings material and immaterial. He felt Aristotle fell short, only proving God as the mover of the outermost sphere. Avicenna wanted the full package, God as the first cause of everything that exists. Averroes, sticking closer to Aristotle, says, nope, metaphysics is about immaterial things, like God and the movers of the spheres. And you prove God's existence through physics by tracing the chain of motion from the sublunar world up to the first mover. See the difference? Avicenna wants a purely metaphysical proof, independent of physical facts. Averroes insists physics is the key. It's not just about turf wars, it's about fundamentally different ways of thinking about God and his relationship with reality. Okay, so how does Avicenna try to build his metaphysical proof? He starts with a fundamental distinction: modality. Anything that exists, let's call it X, either exists necessarily or contingently. Now, necessary existence here means X's existence is self-sufficient. It doesn't need anything else to exist. Contingent existence means if X exists, it needs something else, Y, to be the reason for its existence. So X is contingent in itself, but necessary through Y. Avicenna's first big task is to show that there must be at least one thing that is necessary in itself, something whose existence is self-contained, wajib al-wujud bidatihi. Finding such a being seems like the crucial step towards proving God. But wait, there's a snag. If every contingent thing needs a cause, and that cause might also be contingent, needing another cause and so on, could we just have an infinite chain of causes stretching back forever? Avicenna, being an Aristotelian, believed in the eternity of the world, so he didn't rule out infinite series like past ancestors. But even an infinite series needs a starting point in terms of explanation. Here's his clever move, as reported by Ghazali: consider the entire chain of causes leading to any existing thing X. By definition, this whole chain doesn't have a cause outside itself. Therefore, the whole chain cannot be contingent. But if the whole chain isn't contingent, and it's made up entirely of individual causes, then at least one of those individual causes must be necessary in itself. That necessary being is the uncaused cause within the series. It's the anchor point. Hold on, Ghazali throws a wrench in the works. He looks at Avicenna's argument and says, "You're using the word contingent too loosely." Ghazali argues that if contingent just means having a cause, then Avicenna's logic falls apart. Imagine an infinitely long chain of dominoes. Each domino is caused by the previous one, contingent. But does that mean the entire chain is caused by something outside the chain? Not necessarily. Ghazali suspects that contingent and necessary are just fancy words for caused and uncaused. If that's the case, then Avicenna's inference that the whole series must be non-contingent because it has no external cause doesn't hold water. An infinite series of caused things doesn't logically imply the whole series is uncaused. Ghazali basically says, Avicenna, you haven't clarified what you mean by contingent in a way that makes your argument work. Now, Averroes steps in to defend philosophy against Ghazali, but he does something interesting. He agrees with Ghazali that Avicenna's use of contingent was too broad. To make the argument work, Averroes says, we need a stricter definition. He coins the term truly contingent. What does he mean? He means things that are generable and corruptible, things that could fail to exist, things that come into and go out of being. Think rocks, trees, animals. For Averroes, the only truly contingent things are the material ones we see and interact with. Crucially, this differs from Avicenna, who thought even the eternal heavenly bodies were intrinsically contingent, needing God to sustain their existence moment by moment. Averroes, sticking closer to Aristotle, thinks the heavens are eternal and unchanging, not truly contingent in this stricter sense. With this stricter definition, Averroes reconstructs Avicenna's argument in two stages. Stage 1. Start with the truly contingent things, the stuff that gets generated and corrupted. Since they can fail to exist, sometimes they don't exist. If everything were like that, there would have been a time when absolutely nothing existed. But if nothing ever existed, how could anything begin to exist now? Nothing comes from nothing. So conclusion, not everything is contingent. There must be something that is necessary. Something that always exists. Stage 2, okay, we have a necessary being, but is its necessity self-sufficient? Or does its necessity depend on something else? Averroes argues we can't have an infinite chain of necessary beings, each whose necessity is caused by another. So there must be a necessary being whose necessity is uncaused, a being necessary through itself. And since the heavens are moved and thus need a cause, this uncaused necessary being must be beyond the heavens. Notice how this sounds like Avicenna, but it secretly relies on the Aristotelian physics of motion and the eternity of the heavens. Averroes tried to save the metaphysical flavor, but ended up back at the physical starting line. Thomas Aquinas, heavily influenced by Maimonides and likely Averroes too, presents a very similar argument in his third way. It follows the same structure. Find contingent things, the ones that can cease to exist. Argue that if all were contingent, there'd be a time of nothingness, which is impossible, so there must be a necessary being. Then, argue that this necessary being's necessity must be uncaused, otherwise you get an infinite regress. For Thomas, just like Averroes, contingent means capable of non-existence, generated or corrupted. Necessary means eternal, always existing. So Thomas's argument, while sounding metaphysical, is essentially channeling the Aristotelian physical proof, albeit refined and presented in a way that seems to start from the concept of being itself. So if Averroes and Thomas's approach feels like a return to physics, can Avicenna's original metaphysical path be salvaged? Yes, according to Avicenna, by introducing a crucial distinction, essence and existence. This is his big idea. He says that a thing, let's say a horse, is not identical to its being or existence. Think about it. Before any particular horse existed, what made it a horse? There was already the essence of a horse, the nature of horseness. This essence is what allows statements like, the horse is a quadruped to be true, even before any horse is created. When God creates a horse, he doesn't take pre-existing matter and form it into a horse. Rather, he takes this pre-existing essence of a horse and adds existence to it. Or, for creatures other than God, he causes their essence to receive existence from an external source. How does this work? Think of medieval realist semantics. When we say Socrates is white, the sentence is true because whiteness inheres in Socrates. Similarly, Socrates exists is true because existence inheres in Socrates. Now for a contingent being like Socrates, its essence, what makes it a human being, does not include existence. Existence is something added from the outside. That's why it's contingent. It needs an external cause to give it existence. But for a necessary being like God, its essence does include existence. To be God is to exist. No external cause is needed. This distinction allows Avicenna to say there's an intrinsic difference between needing a cause and not needing one. It also helps him counter Ghazali, even an infinite chain of contingent beings, each with essence plus externally supplied existence, still doesn't solve the problem. The ultimate source of existence must be something whose essence is existence itself. Crucially, let's be clear. Avicenna's argument here isn't the same as Anselm's ontological argument. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Avicenna's argument is causal. He's looking at the effects contingent beings and inferring a cause, a necessary being whose essence includes existence. It's not about analyzing the concept of God. Thomas Aquinas himself acknowledged that God exists is self-evident in itself because for God, the predicate, existence, is identical to the subject God. But since we don't know God's essence, it's not self-evident to us, and we need to demonstrate it through things we do know, like effects. However, Thomas also warned that the idea of an essence which involves existence is too vague. It doesn't uniquely identify God. Many things might fit that description. Okay, so Avicenna and Thomas argue there must be at least one necessary being. But they go further. There can only be one. How do they prove this uniqueness? They draw on an argument from Farabi. Farabi reasoned like this. The first being must be simple, meaning it has no parts and isn't composed of different elements. Why? Because if it were composite, its components and the force holding them together would have to exist before or alongside the composite, making them causally prior. From simplicity, Farabi then jumped to unicity. There can only be one such being. His reasoning? You can't have two truly simple things. If you try, you either have to say they share something and differ in something else, making one composite, or one is defined merely by lacking what the other has, also problematic for simplicity. Either way, you end up contradicting the assumption that both are simple and first. Thomas Aquinas develops this argument for God's simplicity and unicity. He argues God isn't composed in any way, not of parts, matter and form, substance and accident, genus and difference, essence and suppositum, or crucially essence and existence. Why? Again, Farabi's point, composites have prior components. Plus, Thomas adds Aristotle's principle that actuality, what something is now, is prior to potentiality, what it could become. If God's essence didn't include his existence, then his essence would be potentially existent, implying potentiality, and thus not the first being. So God must be pure actuality, an S without addition, a subsistent S. Now, how does this lead to unicity? Thomas argues there can only be one such subsistent S. Just as there could only be one subsistent whiteness, if whiteness could exist alone, there can only be one subsistent existence. This cleverly sidesteps a potential objection to Farabi. What if two first beings share nothing but simplicity? Thomas says no, they must both share the nature of S, which is what individuates them in this context. But hold on, what if we reject Avicenna's core idea that essence and existence are really distinct things? William of Ockham, despite his general critique of realism, raises this point. He argues that white is paronymous from whiteness, grammatically related, but being isn't really paronymous from beingness. When we say white, it signifies something, because there is whiteness in it. But when we say Bucephalus exists, it signifies Bucephalus because Bucephalus exists. Being doesn't connote a deeper beingness the way white connotes whiteness. Furthermore, Bucephalus exists is contingent. Bucephalus is also contingent. It's only true if Bucephalus exists. So, there's no need to imagine a pre-existing essence of Bucephalus waiting for existence. The cause of Bucephalus's existence is external. And God exists is necessary because God exists without a cause, not because his essence inherently includes existence. If Occam is right, and essence and existence aren't really distinct, then what happens to the argument for God's uniqueness? Well, it crumbles. Remember Farabi's argument? It relied on the idea that two simple beings must share something and differ in something, making one composite. If essence and existence aren't distinct, then maybe you could have two gods, each a perfectly simple, indivisible nature, with absolutely nothing in common except that they're both uncaused. Occam concludes that we simply can't demonstratively prove there's only one God. We can show there's a first cause, but not that there's only one. Does this mean we can't prove God's existence either? Occam leaves it open. If by God you mean a unique necessary being, then perhaps the path to demonstration is blocked. Even if we accept the essence-existence distinction, there's another potential infinite regress lurking. Averroes asks, if X is contingent, its existence is caused by something else. But what about the existence of X's existence? Does that require another layer of existence? Does existence itself exist, and if so, does it need an existence of its existence, ad infinitum? It's like asking, is the property of being hot itself hot? Avicenna's answer implicitly is no, because if X is intrinsically necessary, its essence includes existence. The regress stops right there. Since Avicenna claims to prove only one such necessary being, God, the regress is avoided. But this relies heavily on accepting his metaphysics. How did others respond to this regressive existence? Thomas Aquinas tried to dodge it by denying that existence itself exists as a separate entity. But many other thinkers, particularly in the Islamic world blending Avicenna with Sufism, and famously in Christian mysticism like Meister Eckhart, took the plunge. They accepted the regress but identified its endpoint, God. The idea became that the existence of any contingent thing ultimately derives from God. Eckhart's famous phrase captures it. Esse et Deus existens is God. Thomas, in a moment of Neoplatonism, spoke of things participating in being caused by a first being who is most perfectly being. It's like the ancient Greek idea. Things participate in the form of being, and God is that form. Your existence isn't just a property you have, it's a participation in God's own being. Thomas Aquinas, however, was deeply uncomfortable with this view. In his Summa contra Gentiles, he launches a full-blown attack against the idea that God is the formal ess of things, the form that makes things what they are. He insists God is the efficient cause, the maker, the one who brings things into being. God is not the blueprint within the thing, but the architect outside. He worries that if opponents think God inheres in things like a form and matter, it makes God dependent on creatures, looking suspiciously like pantheism. Thomas clarifies, God is just S, but not all S is God. God's essence excludes any addition, unlike a neutral common essence. God is the unique, pure, unadulterated existence. But what if the opponents weren't saying God inheres in things, but rather that things are called beings extrinsically, denominated from a form outside them, like God? Think of it like this. A diet is called healthy extrinsically because it causes health in an animal. An animal is called healthy intrinsically because of its own state. Thomas finds this idea of extrinsic denomination utterly absurd. How can something's very being be extrinsic? Isn't existence the most intrinsic property of a thing? Saying something exists only extrinsically feels like denying it has real existence at all. And this leads to a dangerous place. If everything's existence is just a relation to God, does that mean only God truly exists, and creatures are just shadows or metaphors? This echoes the Arabic concept of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of existence. How could someone try to bridge this gap? Henry of Ghent offers a compromise. He says, let's not think of essence and existence as two distinct things, but as two modes of being in creatures. First, there's esse essentia, the mode of being related to essence. This is the eternal nature of being a human, being an animal, regardless of whether any actual humans or animals exist. This relates to God as the exemplar or formal cause, the perfect model that creatures imitate. Second, there's esse existentiae, the mode of being related to actual existence. This is Socrates' plural, contingent existence. This relates to God as the efficient cause, the one who brings Socrates into being. This avoids the circularity of defining creation as causing existence, because existence here refers to the relation to God as efficient cause, distinct from the relation to God as formal cause. But Henry's view hits a snag. How does it explain why creatures exist properly, while fictional beings like a goat-stag, half-goat, half-stag don't? On Henry's account, both creaturely existence and fictive existence seem to consist in a relation to something else. God for creatures, the mind for fictions. What makes the creature's relation to God real existence, rather than just another kind of parasitic or metaphorical existence, like the fiction's relation to the mind? It's hard to see the difference. And again, the shadow of pantheism looms large. If all existence is just a relation, how do we avoid concluding that only God truly exists? This brings us to John Duns Scotus. Faced with views like Henry's that seem to make creaturely existence extrinsic or metaphorical, Scotus reacted strongly. He insisted that being must be said univocally of God and creatures. Univocity means the word being applies in the exact same way, the same logical sense to both. There's no ambiguity, no fundamental difference in kind. Why? To avoid the perceived absurdity of extrinsic denomination and the consequences that seem to dissolve creaturely reality. He felt that Thomas's earlier attempt at analogy didn't quite cut it either, as it still allowed for dependence and difference. So what's the alternative? Many later scholastics, trying to find a middle ground, focused on the analogy of being. The goal was to acknowledge creaturely dependence on God while maintaining a single, real concept of being. Thinkers like Suarez analyzed different types of analogy. There's proportionality, like health in different organs relates similarly to overall health. There's extrinsic attribution, like calling urine healthy because of the animal it comes from, which Thomas rejected. Suarez proposed a third type, intrinsic attribution. This is where the way something is P involves an essential dependence on how something else is P. His example: the health of an organ, like the heart, depends essentially on the health of the whole animal. The heart is healthy by contributing to the animal's overall health. Suarez suggested this might be the way being works analogically, preserving a single concept while showing creaturely dependence. And so we circle back to where we started with Thomas's fourth way. God is most being, causing lesser degrees of being. But what does that even mean? How do we understand degrees of being? How do we grasp the act of causing being? These are the deep questions that fueled the entire debate. Avicenna's essence-existence distinction offered one path, but led to regress worries and challenges to uniqueness. The Platonic view of participation offered another, but clashed with Thomas's emphasis on God as efficient cause. The distinctions between God's es and creaturely es, and the various analogies attempted, were all desperate attempts to articulate this connection between God and being. It shows the immense struggle medieval thinkers faced in trying to unite theology and ontology, grappling with the profound difficulties raised by pioneers like Avicenna and Thomas. So wrapping up, this journey through medieval thought on God and being reveals a fascinating, complex dance between metaphysics, how we know things, and theology, beliefs about God. The core issues revolved around necessity versus contingency, the relationship between what a thing is and that it is, the unity versus diversity of being, and the huge challenge of explaining how God causally relates to a world full of contingent things without either diminishing God or losing the distinctness of creatures. As we've seen, there wasn't one final answer everyone agreed on. The debates continued, shaping philosophy and theology for centuries.